part of Nature in My Backyard, and we are really pleased. I can't remember if we announced it at the last edition of Brown Bagging It, but we have a brand new website at natureinmybackyard.clevelandaudubon.org. And check it out, because you'll find an abundance of curated resources relating to creative native habitat, I'll get that out, in your yard, along with guidance of how to engage our expert volunteer teams to come to your home and help you transform your yard into quality habitat for all of our natives. You can also access all of our past programs, including our first program in this series, which was delivered almost a year ago. And our first presenter was none other than our presenter today, John Barber. Back then, he was talking about planting is for the birds, and today he's going to be talking about planting for the planet. Before we just get to John's bio, a pitch for next month. On April 9th, Julie Slater will be joining us in conversation on the topic of native plants. It takes a city. And Julie is the director of Meadow City Native Plant Nursery, which is just a phenomenal business on the east side of Cleveland that is growing natives, and you all ought to become familiar with it because it could be a great source for natives for your yard. So you don't want to miss that. And one other thing, that as we get into the program, that we ask that you mute your microphones. And if you have questions, pose them in the chat section, and we will attempt to answer all the questions at the end of the program. And in the chat section, there is a link to John's handout, so that you can click on that and get that. So again, we're pleased to welcome John Barber back. John is a business person, long career in business. However, he has been a biologist, a citizen scientist, a naturalist, a peregrine falcon specialist back in Baltimore, peregrine falcon recovery there. He's a bird bander, a licensed master bander, and he has banded over 60 species in his backyard in Cleveland Heights, a backyard that has been transformed from the traditional grass and non-native plants into a native habitat wonderland that clearly is attractive to both nesting and migrant birds. So an incredible biodiverse backyard. He has been instrumental, along with his partner Peggy Spaeth, in a program called Friends of Heights Parks to help restore parks. The work that's been done around Lower Lake to remove invasives and introduce native plants has been outstanding. But also, he and Peggy have just been amazing ambassadors and evangelists for the native plant movement, and trying to encourage all of us to think native, to plant native, to remove invasives, and do what we can to create quality habitat where we live and get our neighbors to do it as well. So we're really excited to have him back. The name of his program today is called Planting for the Planet 101, and I give you John Barber.
Well, Harvey, thank you so much, and a good day to everyone. Very, very glad to see so many people here. I want to emphasize right from the get-go that this is a 101 level talk. The big emphasis is on practicality, lots of little tips and little techniques that over the years have been shown to really increase the diversity of habitat. A word that you'll hear me use again and again is going to be, how do we build some degree of complexity in our yards? Starting right off, this is our house in Cleveland Heights. On the left side is a mere 7 years ago. The question here today is, how do you transform a yard like this, which was primarily grass, hostas, and one tulip, into a beautiful, beneficial, resilient native habitat? On the right side, you see just a couple years ago what this looked like. What I want to talk about today is, how do you get there? A number of slides are referred to in the handout, and I ask you to please Look at that handout at your leisure, but let's get right into it. Looking around the neighborhood in Cleveland Heights, every yard is very different. And how do we find the right plant for the right place at the right time? Cleveland Heights is a neighborhood of houses primarily built in the 1920s, so they're hitting their century mark now. Much of the landscaping is old. A lot of it is coming down, and we have a great opportunity to move the needle on native plants and on complex beneficial habitat in neighborhoods like this. When we first started looking about right plant for the right place, one of the things that we look for, what are good examples? And the good examples we have can come from webinars like this, but we much prefer to say, go out and look. Mother Nature, parks, natural areas. Yes, it's great to look at books, at apps, at webinars, talk to naturalists, and compare areas of our yards to natural areas and say, that looks like mine, or I'd like to try and build something like that in my yard. And of course, the most obvious comparison is, are you going to be looking to build a shady woodland area, or are you going to have a sunny area that might be called a prairie? And decisions like that are going to drive what you do and how you do it and how it looks on the other end. One of the things that I'm very enthusiastic about is to say, please join a volunteer group doing stewardship in parklands, doing stewardship around houses of faith. Working with volunteers, other volunteers, is one of the most powerful ways to get ideas about the right plant for the right place. In many cases, how to identify the wrong plant for the right place. But working with other volunteers is a phenomenal opportunity. There are so many volunteer groups now working certainly on the east side of Cleveland and all around Northeast Ohio on weekends, during the weekdays. The opportunities are legion, and those opportunities are everything from the real grunt work of removing invasives to picking plants, planting plants, and then critically, how to maintain gardens once they're planted. Bottom left here is Kane Park, the Cleveland Heights City Theater complex now has quite a few natural plantings in it. We have a picture of the Lower Lake crew. We have a picture of the Friends of the Cinder Path. So there are all sorts of opportunities for people to be working. Let's get started. Oftentimes people say make a sketch, and I agree with that. It doesn't have to be a computer-aided design sketch, but that helps, at least I think, it helps to think about what are things going to look like in the long run. The sketch on the left, which is a sketch of the front yard of here at the house at Bradford Road. It doesn't, things don't look exactly like that. The sketch has been modified over the years, but it is a way of saying, what's the big picture that I want to see in a couple of years, maybe? Don't expect to do it all at once. And some very important things to put in this sketch are to mark the compass points to track the path of the sun, and to note where do you have property lines. Most of us can find property corners, particularly in the front of our yards. Depending on what city you live in, you can measure in from the center of the street and find a property corner marker. You want to look for overhead utility lines, particularly because our electric utility, at least in the Heights, has free rein to come in and prune anything and everything away from the wires. And you want to be careful where you plant. You want to look at your drop line that comes from the utility pole to your house and say, what do I want to avoid planting under that? If you're talking about your front yard, Look at the utility pipes, gas, water, and sewer, and plan for access to those utility pipes, particularly where they join the mains out by the street. In many cases, looking at your front yards, you will see a slight depression that leads from the front of your house out to the street, where perhaps a sewer line was replaced, a gas line was dug out, or whatever. As a last, or as an additional tip to find where these lines go under your front yard, you look at where the gas meter is in your basement or on the front of your house, where your water meter is inside the basement of your house. These are places that if you draw a relatively direct line to the street, you'll know where your underground utility pipes are. With the exception of trees and big shrubs, you can still plant over the utility lines or over the utility access points, but you want to be prepared to move the plants if need be. And for flowering plants, that's just fine. We had to have some gas line work done in our front yard, and we simply moved the plants into pots for a couple weeks. The work was done, and we put the plants back in. You can't do that with trees. You don't want to do that with trees. But for flowering plants, that's just fine. But put that on your plan, and put on your plan where your mature trees are and whether or not you want to keep those mature trees in the long run. A very critical point that comes up in many older suburban yards is, are there buried electrical lines? The bottom left picture shows a light socket that was buried in a mass of leaves. The light socket was alive. So the circuit was alive in that light socket, even though the house had been abandoned for some time. It was still alive until the power was eventually cut off to the house. And this is not something that you want to find with a shovel blade. It's not something you want to find with a pickaxe. And so that first sketch of your yard, look at the outside wall of your house, front and back, and see if you see any wires coming out of the basement foundation bricks that you can then start tracking to see if there are buried electrical lines. You look at where the downspout exits are, because we're going to talk about how to disconnect those downspout exits. And then finally, what areas do you want to avoid doing too much work to? And I put this question in here because we were called over to do a consultation at a house. We talked with the homeowner. The homeowner said, I have 5 boys under 10 years old, and I want to know what I can do with my yard. The answer we gave him was, you might plant around the edges, but you're going to have a baseball field for quite a few years into the future, so plant around the edges. One of the things that we did here on Bradford Road, because of a beloved dog, the dog patrolled the fences, the sheriff of Bradford Road, and we put wood chip paths around the perimeter of the yard. And those wood chip paths were not there for us to walk around. They were primarily to say, Dog Jack, this is for you. You're going to try desperately to keep the squirrels out of the yard and out of other intruders. And so we're going to give you a path. So on your map, mark areas that you say, this is a place for paths. So you've got your plans. You're starting to think ahead over the next couple years. What comes out first? Because in most cases, you want to take out big things before you start putting things in. These are primarily non-native invasive plant species. And by that, I include barberry, the various species of barberry, the various species of privet. There are several species of Japanese bush honeysuckle, burning bush, particularly fruiting buckthorn, although eventually you want to take out all the buckthorn, rose of Sharon, the list goes on and on. But if you look at your yard and see these invasive species, start digging them out before you do an awful lot of planting. In many cases, if you decide to dig them out, you will be digging up large root masses. You want to get these things out first before you do a lot of planting. We also decided to take out the non-native ground covers. Vinca, English ivy, oh, English ivy, winter creeper, the euonymus, pachysandra, lily of the valley, very invasive, much slower than English ivy or winter creeper, but still invasive. We had to dig all of these non-native ground covers out. And this takes time, but at the same time, they all have a certain root pattern and a root depth that means you want to address these first before you start planting. What comes out first? The lawn. We started out to take out our lawn in chunks. We dug it out. I'll explain why in a few minutes. But where do you want to start by taking out lawn? You don't want to try to take it out all on that first afternoon if you have a massive lawn. We found taking out patches of lawn, one patch at a time, planting in those patches of removed grass, and then connecting the patches was much easier than trying to take it all out at once. And then finally, look out for human-made debris. The center picture on this slide shows a very small sampling of what was in our backyard. Brick pieces, window sash weights. We found an entire bathroom in the backyard, all the piping, the tile, pieces of a broken sink, pieces of a broken toilet. And all of this had to be removed before we could plant. Oh, and wires, lots of cabling that had just been abandoned in the backyard. So do expect and do take care when you're doing this uh, removal work. Do take care. A lot of broken glass, things like that that you have to be careful of. Keep your tetanus shot booster current. The picture of me on the right is trying to get out that looks like probably an enormous privet bush, privet shrub in the backyard. A lot of this is heavy labor, but get these things out first. Um, Something that is very, very important is to, as a consideration as you improve the habitat in your backyard, is to think about how to keep the rainwater and the stormwater in your yard and not have things be so mounded that it all runs off. The Donebrook Watershed Partnership has lots of tips on how to do that. And one of the things that they start with is to please help keep the street drains clear of trash and debris so that water can move. But the bottom two pictures are the pictures that are most germane to our conversation today. If you look at the picture in the lower left, one of the things that I hope will jump out at you as you see our front yard in progress, if you look at the house side of the sidewalk, you see about a 4 to 5 inch drop off from the grass to the sidewalk. We don't want this. This means that any water that falls quickly in the front yard is going to run immediately onto the sidewalk. And this was something that as we looked at what can we do with our grass, we realized that we had to get a depression. We had to lower the level of the front yard so that the water would stay in the yard and not run off. If you look at the tree lawn right in front of the garden cart, you see once again that we are digging down, taking sod out to lower the level to hold the water. If you don't do that, you end up with the photograph on the right, which is water pooling on the sidewalk, trying desperately to get to the street. If it pools on the sidewalk, it causes nothing but ice in the winter and a mess in the summer. So create concave beds that will hold water rather than creating mounds that will let water run off. Enthusiastically, I encourage disconnecting your downspouts, bringing rainwater into the garden. The Donebrook Watershed Partnership and the Soil and Water Conservation District and all talk about rain gardens. Rain gardens are a great opportunity. You can create a rain garden. It's a lot of work. It's very easy to do. And there are courses offered by the partnership and the Soil and Water Conservation District on how to do it. But you can also simply disconnect your downspouts and run them into the garden and let them flow into the garden. We direct where our downspouts flow throughout the yard with rocks and logs strategically placed, and you can do that. One tip that I have is in many cases, you'll be encouraged to block off with cement the downspout drain that goes underground, that heads for the stormwater drains or something like that. Please don't do that with concrete. You can do it with simple hardware cloth so that debris doesn't get down there, but you want to leave that stormwater pipe access available in the event that, for whatever reason, a subsequent owner wants to reconnect the downspouts or something like that. So don't make it permanent. But you can see that in the center picture, this is in the back of the garage. The right-hand picture shows the downspouts on the back of the garage coming together into a Y and then going under the path into a rain garden, simply inside a PVC pipe so that the downspout doesn't get crushed. And this allows all the water from the garage roof to stay in the backyard, in the rain garden, and sometimes it overflows out the back end of the rain garden, and that's fine. But you can keep the water on site and use it beneficially. You don't have to fight it and try to get rid of it as quickly as you can. Some people ask, should I put in rain barrels? My personal opinion is that rain barrels are an okay idea. Oftentimes, the rain barrels I've had overflow in wet times when I least need it, and they're dry during droughts. So I'm not a big fan of rain barrels anymore. I'd much prefer to say have something a little bit more passive and direct the water into your garden. This means that you need to work with water, not against it. The left-hand picture is the lowest area of our yard. It's right up against the back property line where probably 100 years ago when these houses were put up, there was an intermittent stream that went through the back of the property and in most cases has been blocked off by yards and yards of fill dirt. And thankfully, nobody filled in our backyard. And so for a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two every spring, we have standing water in the backyard, and that's just fine. We have planted wetland species in there, like marsh marigold, not lesser celandine, for those of you who panicked, elderberry, buttonbush. These are species, we have skunk cabbage back there. These are species that thrive in intermittent wet areas. The alternative of saying we're going to try to modify our landscape so strongly to avoid water turns out, we think in most cases, to be very, very much of an uphill battle. And so please don't panic if you have wet areas. Instead, plant for them. As you start thinking about where do I want to put plants, where do I want to take plants out, I ask you to remind yourself that it is all about you. It is not about the neighbors. We're going to talk about the neighbors in a few minutes. But what I ask you to think about first is What do you want to see when you look out your commonly used windows? It's your yard. The emphasis should be on what would I like to see? These are two examples again from Bradford, where we have in the left hand photograph, we have a planter box that all spring, summer, and fall is full of pots of native plants that bring in pollinators and hummingbirds. There's a suet feeder there with a very theatrical downy woodpecker on it. This is our dining room window. This is what we look at when we look out our dining room window. It's all about us. It's what do we want to see? And that planter box filled with native plants in 3 seasons is an incredible benefit to watching wildlife. The picture on the right is the photograph of what we look out of our front window with a redbud and a crabapple and a tulip poplar and a pin oak. But once again, our plan was all about what do we want to see? There are some caveats. You can't take this so far that you have plants that are leaning up against the house or going to grow into the house and windows, plants that are going to block traffic sight lines when you're exiting the driveway. You want to make sure that you can see up and down the sidewalk. Plants shouldn't flop onto the walks and sidewalks. You want to create neat edges. But the overall theme is, what do you want to see from your windows? Let's talk about dog walking for a moment. We're going to get really into the details here. Cleveland Heights in particular, I think most of the heights probably have more dogs than humans living in them. And instead of trying to fight off where dogs pee, we have found it most successful to put in pee posts or pee rocks in the corners of our front yard to say to dogs, pee here, don't pee on our plants, pee here. In the bottom left is a piece of sandstone in one corner of our yard. It was probably no more than 20 minutes after I put it there that the first dog put it there. The first dog peed on it. In the center picture is a pee post, which is simply a piece of firewood buried vertically 10 inches in the ground. Dogs love that. I beg of you, do not buy the plastic fire hydrants that are available online from places like Amazon that are intended to be cute pee posts. You don't need to. You can use a log, you can use a rock, but give them an intentional place rather than trying desperately to keep them away. I do recommend that you avoid planting directly next to those pee posts for 2 reasons. First of all, if you have an enormous number of dogs, the chemistry of the soil around your pee posts will change very quickly and become very, very acidic from the dog's pee, and you're not going to have much success growing things there. The other point, which is much more insidious to me, is with our incessant prophylactic flea and tick treatment for dogs in particular, where we treat them for fleas year round, treat them for worms year round. Dog urine is now laced with fipronil and other chemicals, and that will come out. It does come out in the urine, and that will come out and start to infect the soil around your pee posts. Sadly, what I'm saying is that these pee posts, in essence, become sterile ground, and you don't want to plant flowers that are going to bloom and possibly pick up the insecticide in the dog urine and put it into its pollen and poison pollinators. Another technique that you can use is simply a nudge, what I call a nudge, and that's the picture on the right. This is a picture of some very inexpensive fencing. It doesn't even show up very well here, but it's about 30 inches tall. And all it does is just encourage dog walkers to keep their dogs out of that garden bed. So you can use fences for that. So what goes in first? Infrastructure before plants. If it's within your budget, fence for deer protection. Because of budgetary concerns, we budgeted for one side a year to put up this 6 foot cedar fencing around our backyard. It took a number of years to get the entire backyard fenced in, but uh, fences, particularly fences that the deer can't see through and that are 6 feet tall, are good discouragements for deer. We'll talk about some other discouragements later. Plant your large plants first, such as trees and shrubs. Get your downspouts redirected so that you know where the pipes might run for your downspouts or where existing French drains are. And then finally, where do you want to sit when you're in your yard, not in your house, but when you're in your yard? Start thinking about the places that you want to sit and plan for those areas. Let's talk about deer for a moment. I know that's going to come up. Our philosophy here in Cleveland Heights, where we have a staggeringly high deer population, is that deer are very, very destructive to all phases of native plant growth. And our strategy to deal with them is redirect, repel, fence. The Audubon magazine in the summer of 2024 had a very important article on how the forest composition in wild areas is changing because of the deer pressure. And everything that they talked about for wild areas also applies to our yards and how destructive high deer populations are to a complex native habitat. What do I mean by redirect? We have a tendency to go out and uh, run deer off out of the front yard when they come through, sometimes 6 or 8 at a time. We simply go out and clap and shout at them, much to, I'm sure, much to our neighbors' great amusement or something. But we do that to say, you will not be comfortable here. You will not get comfortable being in our yard. Um, a second technique that we use is to repel. And I have various products here, liquid fence, the salt bags, plant skid, which I believe is a dried blood compound. And we have tried all of these compounds and they work intermittently. One of the things that I have found to be important is, first of all, a fairly frequent application of these deer repellents. And also circulating so that I will use liquid fence and then a couple weeks later I might use plant skid, and after a rain I'll put a new salt bag up. This is a difficult thing to do in an area where there are no predators of deer besides cars. And some communities are doing deer killing programs because otherwise there are no predators. So this is difficult. Redirect the deer, discourage them from hanging out in your yard, repel the deer, use a variety of tactics to repel the deer, and if possible, fence, particularly in the backyard. Fencing is temporary. Sometimes you have to fence specific plants if you can't fence in an area. The upper picture, we use hardware cloth in places where we know that rabbits and voles will be very destructive in the winter. We use hardware cloth. We put those rings up. The rings can come off when the plants are tall enough. We also use tree cages. Some of our stewardship groups feel like we're planting more tree cages on the left there than we are planting trees. That's not the case, but this is hardware cloth, 5 to 6 foot high 5 to 6 foot tall hardware cloth. And this hardware cloth will stay on for a couple of years. And then we'll shift over to the plastic tree guards. Unfortunately, plastic is the best bet. On the right, to keep the bucks from rubbing on the more mature trees. Fencing is temporary. But if you decide that you want to do this, a 100-foot roll or a 50-foot roll is the most inexpensive way to go. And I advise you to pool with other gardeners and say, I need 20 feet, I need 10 feet, or whatever. Pool together. Local hardware stores do sell farm fencing. We'll argue pretty strenuously that you have a newly planted garden. You don't need to buy mulch. As a matter of fact, there are all sorts of issues with the chemicals that are in dyed mulch, the sources for places like cypress mulch. Mulch brings its own list of problems with it. We encourage you to use living mulches, including your fall leaves. You don't chop them up, just put them whole in your garden beds. Wherever possible, plant living mulches like wild strawberry or pussy toes. And there are two examples here, wild strawberry on the left, pussy toes on the right. These make great living mulches, and they are fantastic for pollinators. So please try to avoid the multiple plastic bags of dyed mulch where we really don't know even the source or the transportation costs. And instead, try to work with very, very dense living mulches. If you take nothing else away from this talk today, please take away from this slide that I am talking about planting many more things besides plants to create a complex habitat in your yard. We need complexity. Examples of this are half-buried logs. Go out to your firewood or bum a few pieces of firewood off your neighbor and simply put them down in your garden beds. Sticks, stones, piles of stones, places to dump whole leaves, leave a little bit of bare ground, maybe put in a ring of something, and inside that ring, put some play sand. In every case, the encouragement is to say that our native bees, which are the bees that really need our help, need this kind of complexity. Our beetles are fantastic pollinators of things like pawpaw trees. Beetles, burrowing wasps, all of these creatures need complexity in the garden. So many of our moths and butterflies, eggs overwinter in leaf litter. And if we desperately get all our leaves up and put them off in the street for the city to suck up, in essence, what we're doing is we're taking all the moth and butterfly eggs and sending them away. Or if we run over them with the lawnmower, we're chewing up those egg masses. Please, wherever possible, in a corner of your yard, in multiple corners of your yard, build in complexity. The lower left shows a log that's been buried for just a couple years, and there are decomposers feeding on the bottom of it. There are beetles burrowing into it. There's lichen, as you can see, growing on top of it. In the bottom right are sticks simply left piled there. And things will burrow into those, native bees will burrow into the stems of those and lay their eggs. A really dandy way that saves a lot of space, and this is courtesy of our friend Alex Sitarik, is to take your tomato cages, if you have them in your garage, take your tomato cages every fall when the tomatoes are done and fill them up with whole leaves and just let them sit there all winter long. They will decompose, but in the meantime, the caterpillar eggs, the moth and butterfly eggs, are going to do just fine there. Our gardens are very, very artificial ecosystems. They're constructed microhabitats, but we can construct more complex ones if we do all the things that I suggested on the prior slide. One of the questions that often comes up is, can I just leave everything in my garden? And the answer for woodland gardens is yes, you can, under trees. This has been happening for tens of thousands of years, and lo and behold, the plants have survived, particularly the spring ephemerals like the soon to emerge bloodroot and bluebells and things like that. They will poke up through heavy mats of leaves just fine. But this is not the case if you have full sun, prairie, meadow type habitat where there is no leafy understory. If you think about it from a logic perspective, the plants that grow best there can be smothered by dumping heavy masses of leaves in the fall and thinking that that's a good thing. This doesn't happen. In most cases, for prairies and meadows, the habitat over the every couple of years would burn off the leaf litter and burn off the debris. And this is not something that I'm suggesting that you try at home, that you have prescribed burns in your yard. But it is something where if you have sun-loving plants, you probably will need to move, uh, if you have heavy masses of leaves, you'll need to move that into a corner of the yard or some other place and not leave them on top of your sun-loving plants. An emphasis that I want to repeat here is that when you look at a native garden, we are no longer talking about Memorial Day to Labor Day. Our local garden centers have tried to train us to say that your garden is active from Memorial Day to Labor Day. You throw everything out in September, you buy everything in May. No, what we are talking about here is all 4 seasons. And I encourage you to look at Sharon Sorensen's book, which I believe is on the handout, from 2018. It is at all of our local libraries, Planting Native to Attract Birds to Your Yard. In that book, she talks about how to focus on 4 seasons for our garden. You design your garden for all 4 seasons, not simply for blooming from Memorial Day to Labor Day. Bugs, buds, and shelter in the spring. Bugs, nest sites, and nest materials in the summer. Bugs, fruit, nutritious berries, and shelter in the autumn. And finally, seeds, berries, and shelter in the winter. As you look at removing your lawn and building this habitat in your yard over time, think about it from a 4 season approach, not just from an all summer approach. Historically, we have been trained to say it's the left side of this screen that's most important of this slide. What's the decorative value? How do I screen away from my neighbor? What focal points do I have? What anchors the foundation? The point today, and the point that I ask you to please put into balance is think of the ideas on the right. What will I do for my watershed as I take out my lawn? Food web value, wildlife appreciation, soil restoration, carbon pollinator habitat. Let's put things in balance as opposed to the historic focus on the right. Okay, so what about your neighbors? You take out your lawn, things start to look perhaps a bit shaggy, and you might get some comments from your neighbors. This is where I ask you to be tactful proselytizers, entice, sway, seduce neighbors and passersby. Talking to passersby is the key. We have easily here on Bradford Road 30 to 40 people every day, primarily walking dogs, going up and down the street. Talk to them as you're working. Share plants. You will have plants to share. Tell them what you're doing and emphasize this is intentional. Intentionality is very, very key. Talk up the safety sight lines. We want to avoid running over kids on bicycles. Know the enforced city ordinances, and this will vary by suburb. There are certain cities that do have height restrictions, and they are on the books, but they're not enforced unless they're complaints. We have a project going in Shaker now to update those city ordinances. We hope to use those as model ordinances for other locations. Let people know that you are going to have cages for a few years, tree cages in particular. You can put under construction signs up, like the sign over on the right, habitat restoration in progress. And then finally, you can also put up the charismatic flora and fauna signs. Nature in My Backyard, the sponsor of this talk, has a beautiful sign that you can put up. There's the Heights Native Pollinator Path to join. And then there's some other examples here with the charismatic megaflora and fauna of monarchs and cardinals and things like that. Talk to your neighbors. Please do not huddle hoping that they don't complain. I ask you to remember that the city does not want your water. The city does not want your water. The city does not want your soil washing off the lawn. Really, the city doesn't want your leaves. It's an expense that gets trucked to some other site. And the watersheds don't want your water either, but you do. So when we say bring nature home and keep her there, that includes leaves and soil and water. And design your yard to hold on to those things because they will benefit the complex habitat that you're building. In conclusion, looking forward, change will be constant. The garden will never be finished. Your plants will tell you, I'm happy here or I'm not happy here. Other neighbors who are doing the same thing, your volunteer groups, will happily share plants with you. There are a number of fantastic native nurseries very, very close to us, like Avonlea and Meadow City. These are places that sell locally sourced plants and also have great opinions on what to plant. When you're planting, think ahead to mature sizes. A 5-inch pot of mountain mint in 2 years will probably be 20 inches across, and you'll be looking to share it with neighbors. If plants are happy, they're going to spread, and you'll become a curator. You'll always be curating your garden. It's natural, and it's a lot of fun. So with that, let me stop, and I hope we might have some questions. Thank you very much for your time today.
Hey, thank you, John. Excellent program. What an inspiring program. And it's so amazing, that you're not referring to any other places other than what you've done in your yard and how successful you've been at putting all this into practice and giving us some really a practical approach to how we can do this in our yards. We do have some questions. Just a reminder that the link to John's handout is in the chat section. I think it's the number 2 spot, the HTTPS stuff up there. So if you click on that, you'll have a link to John's handout. Also, Wendy had posted our brand new website, natureinmybackyard.clevelandaudubon.org. And this program will be available if you want to review it and review other programs that have happened over the last year, including John's first program from last spring. You can find those programs archived there. So let's get to the questions that we have. There weren't tons of them, but Patricia was asking, don't the big leaves get matted during the winter? I think you addressed this, but could you just reflect on that, the idea that matted leaves are okay in certain microhabitats in the yard and maybe not? elsewhere.
Yes, Harvey, matted leaves are fine. And the reason I say that is that if you think in the woods, if you're walking in the metro parks or our local parks, we're not buried in leaves. And the matted leaves rot. As they rot, they enrich the soil. As they are decomposing, they provide great habitat and food for the decomposers and great host sites for caterpillar eggs. Oak leaves are probably take the longest to decompose, but most leaves do decompose, and the plants in the woodlands that need to come up through them will poke their way up through them.
We were also reminded by when Dave Tomaszewski talked to us about soft landings, the idea of having an area around your mature trees, particularly oak trees, but others, where you allow the leaves to accumulate, because an awful lot of those butterflies and moths and other organisms that are going to winter over are going to winter over right below the tree. And that if you don't have that safe landing zone, again, you remove an essential habitat for those organisms. Nancy had asked a question, my yard slopes to the sidewalk. Can I just plant down the slope or should I use terracing, both for planting purposes and water retention?
My encouragement to you is to watch the water flowing after you put your garden in. My recommendation is to have logs and rocks and things like that as as water directors on your slope. Terracing involves putting something in place that is a formal terrace. You may want to do that from an appearance perspective, but my hope is that you can put um, uh, primarily logs that will rot over time and rocks that won't rot over time, perpendicular to the water flow, that will help direct the water flow. You can even build low spots to temporarily hold the water. Once again, trying to keep it on your property.
Actually, if you could create depressions rather than mounds, that's the way to go. You've had a couple shout outs for outstanding program, particularly for all of the ecologically sound advice and good ideas. Someone asks about where do you get the nature in my backyard sign? You can, if you go to natureinmybackyard.clevelandaudubon.org, there's information about how you can enroll in Nature in My Backyard. And if you have a team come by your house, we actually will provide you with a sign. So that's easy enough. And then a companion question is, do you recommend just letting nature do the planting?
I don't. In suburban neighborhoods. The reason I say that and say that so emphatically is that our yards, particularly the peripheries of our yards, have massive quantities of glossy and common buckthorn and Japanese bush honeysuckle and privet and barberry and so many invasive species that are very, very prolific seeders. And those seeders are spread by water, they're spread by birds, they're spread by wind. We have Norway maples everywhere, all sorts of things that are invasive and highly invasive and will outcompete our native plants if given a chance. And this is where the curation comes in. Uh, I, uh, I ask you to think about planting native plants in one section of your yard, expanding that section year by year, but revisiting that section all the time to say, what's coming up there? Because for a couple of years, you will have invasive plants that are in the seed bank um, or spread by birds or water or whatever, trying to take over again, and you have to fight that back. And it is a battle. The example I'll use is European, I'm sorry, common buckthorn. Common buckthorn is everywhere in our parklands and in our yards, very recognizable by the long thorns and the buck-like bud. It is a very prolific berry producer. Um, the female plants, there are male plants and female plants, produce scads of berries that are eaten by birds. It is a diuretic. It causes diarrhea in birds. It weakens migrants when they eat those berries because it causes diarrhea. But the seeds are spread so quickly and so readily. Another example is Rosa Sharon, which is the seeds are spread by the wind. You can have thousands of Rosa Sharon plants coming up around a neighbor's shrub, and you need to beat those back and overwhelm them with native plants.
Good advice. A question, Susie, as early in your talk, you mentioned 4 plants for temporary standing water, aconite and 2 to 3 others. I didn't get them written and do not see them in the handout materials. Was that
Skunk cabbage is one. Marsh marigold, Caltha palustris. Marsh marigold is another. Elderberry is a wonderful wet-loving shrub. It loves its feet to be wet. Buttonbush is a staggering butterfly attractor, and it will grow in standing water or intermittently wet water or areas that are only occasionally wet. So buttonbush and elderberry, marsh marigold, skunk cabbage, all of these plants are available through our local nurseries and will do quite well in wet spots.
Well, I think that's all the questions. Again, John, fabulous program. Thank you so much. This is incredibly inspiring, particularly because you really show us how we can approach this very logically and methodically and get the job done. Something that we all, I hope, aspire to do here is to create thriving, biodiverse native habitats wherever we live. So you're getting lots of great programs and applause. So thanks to John for this outstanding program. And thanks you all for joining us. Just a reminder that on April 9th, Julie Slater from Meadow City Native Plant Nursery will be joining us, and she'll be giving us her perspective on her talk is entitled Native Plants, It Takes a City, which should be fun. And of course, that's one of the places that John mentioned as a source for native plants when you do get to that point where you want to start adding native plants to your yard. So excellent program. Thank you all for joining us. Get out and enjoy the sunshine and the early spring weather. And we thank you so much for being part of brown bagging it in my backyard. So long.